Fog City.
So we are talking Fog City. This is written and directed by Steve Wolsh. And I was made aware of this movie through a campaign when they were, you know, advertising that you could get Steelbook and stuff like this. But I was a bit kind of hesitant, to be honest, because I've reviewed a couple of Steve Wolsh's previous movies, Kill Her Goats and Muck. Neither of which I was a particular fan of, and they tended to have similar kind of styles in some ways. Lots of boobs, lots of kind of gloss, but not much in regards to kind of cohesive narrative and things like this. So I was a little hesitant to pull the trigger on Fog City, but let's talk about Fog City and what its kind of premise is. It focuses on a group of young yuppies who are kind of friends, and they come from a kind of a wealthy background, the majority of them, and they all end up around this one particular kind of like girl's parents' house, and it's in a large house in Cape Cod, which is where Walsh is from and where his kind of films kind of tend to be made and take place in. And there seems to be a mysterious kind of orange fog which is kind of coming towards them. And we learn earlier in the movie that our main girl, our main kind of character, her father owns this kind of factory, but no one really knows what it kind of produces, and there's rumours that it's some type of chemical weapon, etc. So everyone's kind of panicking, thinking it might be a spill from the factory. There's a siren going off, etc. And so they all end up kind of like, some will try to run, some will try to kind of hold up, but they all end up back in this house and end up kind of going crazy. Now, is this an effect from the actual kind of this mysterious fog and what's in the fog? Or is it simply kind of like fear and paranoia causing these young people to kind of go crazy? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what I think works in Fog City. So as with Walsh's previous movies, he kind of tries to avoid CGI and all tends to go for a practically made movie in regards to its VFX, and that's true of this one as well. So all the kind of the VFX you'll see on display here are practical, and they are well done. You know, it's not as kind of gory and gruesome as I would say some of the other movies that he's done. This is almost more of a thriller really rather than a horror. But there are certainly some violence, particularly kind of in the last kind of act of the movie, and it is well done. You know, it looks pretty good practical effects. The other thing I would say as well, that's true of this kind of writer director, is his films tend to have a very kind of like glossy look. I mean, he always casts very kind of like Playboy-esque kind of buxom women who always tend to kind of shed their clothes. The movie always has this kind of like sheen to it that gives it this kind of Hollywood kind of glow, if that makes sense. So it has this kind of like polished look. There's lots of kind of sports cars. He uses techniques where he'll kind of like, you know, have a shot from a certain angle, and then you'll kind of almost see like a replay from a kind of a different angle in slow motion and things like that. That gives it this kind of like, you know, this kind of sheen, this kind of like this polish to it. And there are some pretty good kind of stunts, and I have to be honest with you, I think the visuals of this kind of, you know, fog, kind of like rolling towards this kind of house. You know, it looks good, it looks scary, it looks spooky, and obviously we've seen plenty of kind of like fog or mist-related kind of like horror movies to this point, so the cinematography was on point. So ultimately what we're kind of getting at here is, I think aesthetically this movie works on many levels, you know, both kind of technically and sort of artistically. But that's also true of Walsh's previous movies to a certain degree. This one has a little less nudity than his other films, I would say. There is still a couple of boobs, but not quite as many as maybe some of the other films that he's made. But what doesn't work in this movie, I'm going to try and be as vague as I can here, but you may sort of get the gist of where I'm going. So I'll remain as non-spoilery as possible. So, but before we kind of get into story elements, let me talk about some other things. So the acting, I don't think the acting is particularly strong here. Now, if you are a B-movie fan and you are kind of experienced in watching independent B-movie horrors, it's okay for that kind of level, I would suggest. It's not going to be winning any like awards for dramatic acting, but put a pin in that, because I am actually going to come back into it with, I think, why in this particular film it's maybe more of a problem than other B-movies. So the acting isn't particularly good. To go in kind of unison with that, I think the dialogue is pretty ropey. I mean, when you watch the very first scene of this film, there's two girls talking in a kind of a diner, and just listen to the dialogue and ask yourself, does that sound like realistic dialogue that two people would be saying? I don't think so. It sounds like a script. It just doesn't sound like a conversation that any two girls would be having. Certainly the way it's kind of presented to me. It sounds like some guy who has written a script and got these people to say it in reasonably unconvincing way. So we don't have particularly strong acting, I don't think. Although it's, like I said, I think it's, you know, you may find it passable. So let's just go back to that. I think here's the problem, is this movie is trying to be somewhat of a psychological horror movie / thriller. And therein lies the problem with having this kind of like weaker dialogue and weaker acting. Because if you're having a monster flick and if you're having a slasher, I think things like that, you can kind of get away, I think, with, you know, not quite stellar acting, not quite stellar dialogue. However, when you are doing a psychological type movie, I think you have to have a little bit more believability and kind of like realistic dialogue and performances that seem a little bit more sincere and authentic, and this one does not have this. And this movie certainly is more of a kind of trying to be a psychological horror movie more than anything else. It's like, is there something in the fog, or is this just irrational fear kind of like getting the better of us? And again, without trying to be kind of spoilery at all, let's talk about the plot and the kind of the narrative here. I have to say, I think there are some issues with the way this narrative is going. I guessed this movie straight away when it started. I guessed the end and I was 100% right. And I have to say, I think the way these people are acting is irrational straight from the get-go. Even before the fog arrives, these people just seem stupidly irrational. And there's like no cell service, no mobile phone signal. Okay, let's maybe check the internet, maybe check the radio, maybe check the TV to see if any kind of news reports. No, we won't do any of that. You know, no, none of that. It's just like, but even without all that, just let's pretend there was no TV and none of that available. I still think the way these people were overacting, not so much in their acting performance, but in the way the characters were written, is just too over the top. It just seems ridiculous. I think what happens in the movie is just kind of silly and overdone. Yes, you can maybe look at it. It's a silly piece of B-movie schlock that doesn't really make sense. But I think the movie is trying to be, like I say, more of a psychological and questioning, like the basically like cabin fever ultimately, and what it means to have fear and paranoia and how it'll affect you and stuff. So it doesn't really work. I just think these kind of like the actions for the people just seem completely irrational. Now there may have been ways that they could have worked around this. They were high or something like this, or you know, other things. But it doesn't really work. I have to say, it just seems stupid and overdrawn. The bulk of the running time is people arguing. I've had this kind of issue with other films. A lot of found footage movies tend to have this kind of thing. Let's pad out the running time and have all this inflated drama by watching scenes of people arguing. And I would say that's a good 60% of the screen time in this film. People arguing when they're not fighting and trying to kill each other. It's people arguing. Does that sound like a interesting watch? No, it doesn't. I wouldn't say. Is there anything visually interesting outside of the kind of the technical element here and the artistic? Not massively. There are some reasonable practical effects here, but the movie feels quite hollow once you have watched it, I would say, and it feels overlong, and it feels like the narrative probably should have been a short film, but kind of it's been expanded to be a feature length. There is not enough story here to have a feature length movie. So it feels like you're just repeating those same beats, and you're kind of watching these actors who are not particularly convincing, with unrealistic dialogue, who are massively overblown in their kind of reactions to something which is, and put yourself in their position, what would you do? And it just doesn't make sense. It's just illogical and silly. So I found this movie to be not even as good as the other films that Wolsh has done, because at least that had a little bit more interesting things going on screen. This one does not. And even what it's trying to do, it's trying to be more of this kind of psychological study on the human mind and stuff. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. I honestly think Wolsh is quite a talented director, certainly in his visual style, but damn, he needs to work off someone else's script. The guy cannot write a movie. He also needs a producer to push back on him. I know this is an independently produced movie, so that you tend not to have that level of kind of pushback, but this is why you should ask for criticism. I mean, Wolsh is banging out films now, so I'm guessing that he must have some success, but it's just, and the frustrating thing is that there's definitely the potential here for an interesting kind of movie in regards to, because it certainly has a flair for the visual style here, but it's just not interesting, and what you have got, the elements you have got on screen, are not well done, and it's a little bit kind of incoherent in regards to any type of real logic. So I found this movie, although it's visually well put together, just kind of quite poor on the narrative level, quite poor in the acting, quite poor in the dialogue. So overall, it's quite poor for me. So I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.